What if I told you there is one specific type of empath that a narcissist can never manipulate, can never intimidate, and ultimately can never control? It is not because they are stronger, louder, or more ruthless. It is because they stop giving the narcissist the one thing they desperately need to survive. By the end of this presentation, you will understand why this particular empath quietly dismantles a narcissist's entire psychological game and why most people never realize they are becoming that person until the narcissist begins to unravel. Most people think empaths are easy targets because they care deeply, forgive quickly, and always try to see the good in others. That belief is exactly what narcissists count on. But something remarkable happens when an empath stops confusing kindness with self-sacrifice. There comes a moment when empathy becomes wisdom instead of vulnerability. That is the moment everything changes. If you have ever wondered why someone who once chased your attention suddenly becomes obsessed with getting it back after you have healed, then stay with me. What you are about to hear may completely change how you understand both narcissists and empaths. Most people imagine that every empath has the same personality, the same strengths, and the same weaknesses. That assumption is exactly what creates confusion when dealing with narcissistic behavior. While many empaths are deeply compassionate, emotionally intuitive, and willing to understand the struggles of others, not all have reached the same level of emotional growth. The one empath who truly disrupts a narcissist's sense of control is not simply someone who feels deeply. It is someone whose compassion has been strengthened by experience, self-awareness, and healthy boundaries. This empath no longer mistakes endless giving for love, or endless tolerance for kindness. They understand that caring for another person should never require abandoning themselves. A narcissist often expects empathy to be predictable. They assume kindness can be exploited, forgiveness can be demanded, and patience can be stretched indefinitely. In the beginning, this expectation may appear accurate because many empaths naturally seek harmony and often believe conflict can be resolved through understanding. However, a self-aware empath eventually recognizes patterns instead of isolated incidents. They stop making excuses for repeated manipulation and begin evaluating actions rather than promises. That shift is deeply unsettling for a narcissist because their influence depends on the other person continually doubting their own perceptions. What makes this empath especially difficult to manipulate is not anger, revenge, or emotional hardness. It is clarity. They remain compassionate without becoming compliant. They can acknowledge another person's pain without accepting abusive behavior. They are capable of listening without surrendering their judgment, forgiving without reopening harmful doors, and caring without allowing guilt to dictate every decision. Their emotional intelligence becomes a quiet form of strength that cannot be easily shaken by blame, flattery, intimidation, or dramatic emotional displays. A narcissist's emotional world is often sustained by a constant need for attention, validation, and influence over other people. Whether the attention is positive or negative is often less important than the fact that it keeps them at the center of someone else's emotional focus. An argument, a desperate attempt to explain, repeated forgiveness, or endless reassurance can all serve the same purpose by confirming that they still occupy space in another person's mind. This is why many narcissistic relationships become cycles of emotional highs and lows, where the goal is not genuine connection, but maintaining psychological control. A healed empath gradually changes this dynamic in ways the narcissist struggles to understand. Instead of reacting to every accusation, defending every misunderstanding, or chasing every moment of approval, they begin responding with calm consistency. They no longer measure their worth by the narcissist's changing opinions or unpredictable moods. Their emotional stability becomes independent of external validation, making them far less vulnerable to manipulation. The narcissist may continue using familiar tactics such as guilt, love bombing, the silent treatment, or emotional confusion. But those strategies lose their impact because the empath no longer provides the emotional fuel that once kept the cycle alive. The most significant shift is internal rather than external. The healed empath stops believing they are responsible for managing another person's emotions or repairing every conflict alone. They recognize that healthy relationships require mutual accountability and respect. As they release the need to earn acceptance or prove their loyalty, the narcissist loses access to the emotional reactions that once reinforced control, leaving manipulation increasingly ineffective and emotionally unrewarding. Many people believe that confronting a narcissist with facts, exposing contradictions, or winning an argument will finally change the relationship. In reality, arguments often become opportunities for manipulation rather than resolution. A narcissist may shift blame, deny previous statements, distort events, or redirect the conversation until the original issue is forgotten. The discussion becomes less about finding truth and more about maintaining dominance. Even when the other person presents clear evidence, the narcissist can transform the conversation into an exhausting emotional battle that leaves the empath confused, frustrated, and questioning their own reality. Healthy boundaries create an entirely different dynamic. A boundary is not an attempt to control another person's behavior. It is a clear statement of what you will and will not accept, followed by consistent action. Instead of explaining endlessly why disrespect is hurtful, the healed empath simply refuses to participate in conversations that become abusive. Instead of threatening consequences they never enforce, they calmly follow through on their decisions. This consistency removes the endless negotiations that narcissists often rely upon to regain influence. What makes boundaries so threatening is that they cannot be argued away if they are consistently maintained. A narcissist may criticize them as selfish, accuse the empath of being cold, or insist they have changed overnight. These reactions are often attempts to make the empath abandon their limits through guilt or self-doubt, but the emotionally mature empath understands that protecting their peace is not an act of punishment. It is an act of self-respect. When words and actions remain aligned, manipulation has fewer openings to exploit, and the narcissist finds themselves facing limits they cannot easily dismantle. One of the greatest misconceptions about empathy is that it requires endless sacrifice. Many people are taught that being compassionate means always saying yes, always giving another chance, and always placing someone else's needs ahead of their own. A narcissist often encourages this belief because it creates an environment where they receive constant attention, forgiveness, and emotional support without being expected to offer the same in return. Over time, the empath may become exhausted, believing that if they simply love harder or understand more deeply, the relationship will eventually become healthy. The strongest empath learns that compassion and self-abandonment are not the same thing. They can recognize another person's pain without allowing that pain to justify manipulation, dishonesty, or emotional abuse. They understand that someone may have experienced genuine hardship while still choosing behaviors that harm others. This balanced perspective prevents them from confusing explanation with excuse. Instead of trying to rescue someone who refuses accountability, they acknowledge the reality of the situation and protect their own emotional well-being. A narcissist often expects kindness to come without limits. They may rely on guilt, emotional stories, or promises of change to regain access whenever the empath begins to pull away. The emotionally mature empath listens with understanding, but evaluates whether actions consistently match the words being spoken. They no longer confuse temporary remorse with lasting transformation. Their compassion remains intact because it reflects their character rather than the narcissist behavior. Yet it is guided by wisdom instead of obligation. This combination makes them far less vulnerable to emotional exploitation while allowing them to remain caring without becoming enabling or losing themselves in another person's chaos. If this message is helping you see relationship dynamics more clearly, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your experience in the comments. Your story may help someone else recognize the patterns they have been struggling to understand. When a healed empath begins to detach emotionally, it is often misunderstood by the narcissist and even by people observing the relationship. Some assume the empath has become cold, distant, or uncaring, because they no longer react with the same intensity they once did. In reality, emotional detachment in this context is not the absence of feeling, it is the presence of emotional balance. The empath still experiences compassion, disappointment, and concern, but those emotions no longer dictate every decision or pull them back into unhealthy patterns. A narcissist typically relies on emotional unpredictability to maintain influence. Sudden affection may follow harsh criticism. Promises of change may appear after periods of neglect. Dramatic apologies can come just as the empath is preparing to leave. These emotional swings often create confusion, making it difficult to separate genuine connection from manipulation. A healed empath begins to recognize these recurring cycles instead of becoming consumed by each individual moment. They stop interpreting every emotional display as proof that lasting change has finally arrived. This calm emotional distance can feel deeply unsettling to a narcissist because it removes the reactions they once depended on. Attempts to provoke guilt, jealousy, fear, or urgency no longer produce the expected response. The empath listens without absorbing every accusation, observes without immediately defending themselves, and makes decisions based on consistent behavior rather than temporary emotions. This is not emotional numbness or revenge. It is the result of healing from repeated manipulation and learning that protecting inner peace requires thoughtful boundaries. The quiet stability of the empath reflects growing self-respect, making it increasingly difficult for emotional pressure to pull them back into the same destructive cycle. When a narcissist realizes that their usual methods are no longer producing the same results, they often do not accept the loss of control quietly. Instead, they may intensify their behavior in an effort to regain influence. This escalation can be confusing because it sometimes appears as sudden affection, overwhelming apologies, or dramatic promises of change. At other times, it takes the form of criticism, guilt, intimidation, or attempts to provoke emotional reactions. Although these behaviors may seem very different on the surface, they often serve the same purpose, which is restoring the dynamic in which the narcissist remains at the center of the empath emotional world. A healed empath begins to recognize this pattern instead of responding to each incident in isolation. They understand that manipulation often becomes stronger when it is losing its effectiveness. Rather than viewing increased attention as proof of genuine transformation, they ask whether the long-term behavior of the person has actually changed. They pay attention to consistency instead of intensity. A single heartfelt conversation no longer outweighs months or years of repeated disrespect, broken promises, or emotional instability. This shift in perspective makes the empath far more difficult to control. They refuse to confuse urgency with sincerity or emotional displays with accountability. Even when the narcissist alternates between charm and hostility, the empath remains focused on observable actions rather than persuasive words. Their responses become measured instead of reactive, reducing opportunities for manipulation to take hold. As the familiar strategies of the narcissist lose their emotional impact, they often become increasingly frustrated because the predictable cycle that once kept the relationship under their influence is no longer unfolding in the way they expect. When a narcissist realizes that their usual methods are no longer producing the same results, they often do not accept the loss of control quietly. Instead, they may intensify their behavior in an effort to regain influence. This escalation can be confusing because it sometimes appears as sudden affection, overwhelming apologies, or dramatic promises of change. At other times, it takes the form of criticism, guilt, intimidation, or attempts to provoke emotional reactions. Although these behaviors may seem very different on the surface, they often serve the same purpose, restoring the dynamic in which the narcissist remains at the center of the empath emotional world. A healed empath begins to recognize this pattern instead of responding to each incident in isolation. They understand that manipulation often becomes stronger when it is losing its effectiveness. Rather than viewing increased attention as proof of genuine transformation, they ask whether the long-term behavior has actually changed. They pay attention to consistency instead of intensity. A single heartfelt conversation no longer outweighs months or years of repeated disrespect, broken promises, or emotional instability. This shift in perspective makes the empath far more difficult to control. They refuse to confuse urgency with sincerity or emotional displays with accountability. Even when the narcissist alternates between charm and hostility, the empath remains focused on observable actions rather than persuasive words. Their responses become measured instead of reactive, reducing opportunities for manipulation to take hold. As the familiar strategies lose their emotional impact, the narcissist often becomes increasingly frustrated because the predictable cycle that once kept the relationship under their influence is no longer unfolding in the way they expect. The most powerful empath is not the one who loves the hardest, forgives the fastest, or sacrifices the most. It is the one who has learned that compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction, and that genuine kindness never requires accepting manipulation. When you stop chasing approval, stop explaining your worth, and stop carrying responsibility for the choices of someone else, you take away the very foundation on which narcissistic control depends. That is why your healing feels so threatening. Your calm replaces chaos. Your clarity replaces confusion. Your boundaries replace endless negotiations, and your peace becomes something they can no longer disturb. If this message resonated with you, remember that healing is not about becoming less empathetic. It is about becoming wiser with your empathy. Protect your heart without closing it. Trust your instincts without doubting yourself. Choose relationships built on mutual respect instead of emotional control. Because the moment you value your own peace more than the need to fix someone who refuses to change, you become the one person a narcissist can no longer manipulate. And that is not just freedom. It is the beginning of a life where your compassion finally serves you instead of being used against you.